Imagine being the firstborn son of a man chosen by God, only to find yourself abandoned in the middle of a desert with no hope of survival. This is the shocking story of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, who in a single moment saw his life change forever. How would you react if everything you knew, every sense of belonging, and every dream of the future were torn away from you in such a cruel way? Ishmael's journey is one that begins with despair and ends with a destiny greater than he ever imagined, a path filled with betrayal, miracles, and the undeniable truth that when everything seems lost, God still writes the final chapter. Long before Ishmael was born, Abraham lived as a man of unwavering faith. From a young age, he had believed the promises of God, who told him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But as the years stretched on, the promise felt more and more like a distant echo. His wife, Sarah, felt the weight of each passing year more heavily, and their home was often filled not with laughter, but with silence that carried the sorrow of unfulfilled dreams. They were faithful yet human, and the shadow of doubt crept into their hearts each time they wondered if God's promise had simply come too late. Sarah's struggle grew unbearable as she looked at her reflection, lines of age marking her face while the cradle in her tent remained empty. The silence of the nights pressed down on her, and eventually her desperation birthed an idea she never thought she would entertain. She approached Abraham with trembling resolve, suggesting that he take her servant Hagar, and perhaps through her the family they had longed for would finally come. It was a choice born of anguish, a human attempt to speed up the divine plan, but it would set in motion events that would scar generations. Hagar, the Egyptian servant, was suddenly pulled into a role she had never sought. Without her consent, her life shifted from serving in the background to carrying the child of the man through whom nations had been promised. At first she remained quiet, but as her belly grew with the life of Ishmael, so too did her sense of pride. For the first time she felt power where once she had known only submission. She, the servant, was giving Abraham what Sarah could not. And though she did not speak it aloud, her eyes began to reflect this unspoken truth, igniting a fire of resentment in Sarah's heart. The tension grew unbearable within Abraham's household. Sarah, who had initiated this arrangement, soon regretted it deeply. Each glance at Hagar, each reminder of the life growing inside her, felt like salt on an open wound. What had been meant as a solution now became a source of rivalry and bitterness. The once quiet home of faith and waiting became filled with unspoken accusations, jealousy and pain that neither Abraham's patience nor Sarah's tears could heal. The air was thick with conflict, and every day it grew harder for Hagar to remain. Finally, the weight was too heavy. Hagar could no longer endure Sarah's sharp words, her cold stares, or the suffocating atmosphere inside the camp. One night, when the desert lay cloaked in darkness and silence, she made her choice. Gathering what little she could carry, she fled into the wilderness, her heart heavy with fear, but also with determination. She thought she was running toward freedom, but in reality, she was stepping into a trial far greater than the one she left behind. The desert was merciless. Its heat by day and its chilling winds by night beat down on her fragile body. Pregnant and alone, her steps grew heavier with every mile. The thirst cracked her lips and exhaustion blurred her vision. She found herself collapsing beside a spring of water, her spirit broken, her tears falling into the dust. She believed she had escaped human cruelty, only to be delivered into the jaws of death itself. In her despair, she lifted her face to the heavens, not knowing if anyone would hear. But someone did. In the silence of the wilderness, a voice broke through, gentle, yet carrying eternal authority. "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" Trembling, she looked up and saw a radiant figure before her. An angel of the Lord had appeared, and in that moment the barren desert became holy ground. With a voice choked by tears, she told the messenger her story, the harsh treatment, the unbearable rivalry, and the hopelessness that had driven her into the desert. The angel's response was both a command and a promise. "Return to your mistress and submit to her hand, for I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And then came the revelation that would shape her child's destiny. "You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction." Those words burned into her heart like fire, and for the first time in weeks, her tears were not of despair, but of relief. God had not forgotten her. He had seen her pain, and he had already written a future for the child she carried. With renewed strength, Hagar rose from the spring of water. She was no longer just a servant running from her master. She was the chosen mother of a son whose life would carry divine purpose. The desert, once her enemy, now felt like a silent witness to a covenant larger than her suffering. She walked back to Abraham's camp with the certainty that though her life was difficult, she was carrying within her womb a promise greater than herself. The name Ishmael, meaning God hears, would forever be a reminder that no cry is too faint for heaven to hear. Months later, Ishmael was born, and Abraham's household once again felt the joy of a child's laughter. For Abraham, holding his son brought relief, a glimpse of the promise finally unfolding before his eyes. Yet beneath the joy lingered an invisible tension. Ishmael's birth was not the end of their story, but the beginning of one more complex, filled with both divine blessing and human conflict. The boy's cries in the night echoed across the camp, like an answer to years of silence, but they also cast long shadows into the future. Even as Ishmael grew, Sarah's heart remained restless. Though she had offered Hagar as the vessel of hope, the child's very existence was a reminder of her own barrenness, a mirror of her deepest wound. Abraham tried to balance his love for his wife and his son, but the strain between the two women carved invisible lines that even his faith could not erase. The promise of God was alive, but it had not yet brought peace. And as Ishmael learned to take his first steps, the seeds of conflict had already been sown in the soil of his destiny. As Ishmael grew stronger, his presence in Abraham's household became both a blessing and a source of silent unease. The boy was lively, curious, and carried the pride of being Abraham's firstborn. Every time Abraham looked at him, he saw not just his son, but the unfolding of God's promise of countless descendants. Yet for Sarah, each smile of the boy was a painful reminder of her own unfulfilled longing. She tried to ignore it, but jealousy and sorrow gnawed at her heart, creating a wound that time refused to heal. Sarah's struggle reached its breaking point when, against all human possibility, she conceived a child of her own. The miracle came unexpectedly, like the sudden bloom of a flower in barren soil. She bore a son and named him Isaac, meaning laughter, for God had turned her tears into joy. The camp erupted in celebration, for the impossible had become reality. Yet beneath the joy, the presence of two sons, one born of promise and the other of human arrangement, cast a long shadow that threatened to divide the family forever. With Isaac's arrival, the dynamic inside the household shifted drastically. What had once been Ishmael's domain of attention and affection was now shared, and more often than not, it felt to him as though it was stolen. Abraham's arms now cradled another son, and Sarah's pride glowed with every glance at her miracle child. Ishmael, still young but old enough to understand the difference, began to sense the subtle distance growing between himself and the place he had once held at the center of his father's world. The rivalry between the two boys was not one of equal ground. Isaac was hailed as the child of the divine promise, while Ishmael was whispered about as the child of human decision. Though Abraham loved both, the way others treated them made Ishmael feel as though his very existence was a challenge to the joy of his younger brother. Each day became a silent competition for attention, and each look from Sarah carried the weight of judgment. The desert winds seemed to carry not only sand, but whispers of resentment. The defining moment came during a great feast celebrating Isaac's weaning. The air was filled with music, laughter, and joy as Abram held his miracle child high for all to see. But amid the revelry, Ishmael's laughter cut through the celebration in a different tone. His mockery of Isaac, though brief, carried the sting of rebellion and the weight of rivalry. To Sarah, it was not merely a boy's jest. It was a threat, a sign that the firstborn might one day overshadow the true heir of promise. Her heart hardened, and her fears crystallized into a single, irrevocable decision. That night, Sarah approached Abraham with a firmness he had never seen in her before. "Cast out this slave woman and her son," she demanded, her voice trembling not with weakness but with conviction. "For the son of this servant shall not be heir with my son Isaac." The words pierced Abraham like a blade. Ishmael was his flesh and blood, the boy he had raised, the first to call him father. To let him go was to tear apart his very soul. Yet Sarah's plea was not merely emotional, it was born of her determination to secure Isaac's future, the child of God's covenant. Abraham wrestled through the night with a heart torn in two. He walked beneath the stars, the same stars God had once pointed to when promising descendants beyond number. How could he reconcile the promise with the thought of losing his firstborn? His prayers rose like smoke into the heavens, seeking clarity. And in that moment of anguish, God spoke to him, affirming that Isaac was indeed the heir of the covenant, but that Ishmael too would be blessed. Though the decision would break Abraham's heart, it carried the assurance that Ishmael's life was not being discarded, but redirected into a destiny of its own. With dawn came the unbearable task. The desert sky was painted gray, as if even creation mourned what was about to unfold. Abraham placed bread and a skin of water into Hagar's hands, his eyes heavy with sorrow. He kissed his son, holding the boy for a moment longer than he should have, trying to memorize his face, his laugh, his presence. Then, with tears in his eyes, he watched as Hagar and Ishmael walked away from the camp, their figures shrinking against the vast emptiness of the wilderness. Each step away echoed like a hammer striking his heart. The desert welcomed them, not with mercy, but with relentless cruelty. The waterskin emptied quickly under the burning sun, and the dry wind cut across their skin like blades. Ishmael, exhausted and thirsty, stumbled beside his mother. Hagar's strength waned as she realized she could no longer shield her son from the inevitable. With trembling hands, she placed him beneath the shade of a small bush, unable to watch his suffering. She walked a short distance away, lifted her voice and wept bitterly, convinced that she would soon lose the child she had once been promised would lead to a great nation. It was in that place of despair, when hope seemed buried beneath the sands of death, that heaven moved once again. Hagar heard a voice, not from the wind, not from her imagination, but from above. "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." As she opened her tear-filled eyes, she saw before her what she had missed before, a well of water shimmering like a miracle in the heat of the desert. Her hands shook as she filled the skin, rushing back to lift her son's head and give him drink. Life returned to Ishmael as water touched his lips, proof that God had not abandoned them. The desert that had seemed like a grave became a sanctuary of survival. Each drop of water was more than relief. It was a promise renewed. Ishmael would not perish in the wilderness. He would rise from it, forged by its trials, marked by its silence, and blessed by the hand of God. Hagar held her son close, her tears now transformed from sorrow into gratitude. She realized that even in abandonment, they were never truly alone. God's plan was greater than the cruelty of man, and the wilderness was not the end, but the beginning of Ishmael's destiny. And so mother and son continued their journey through the vast expanse of the desert, no longer as fugitives, but as survivors chosen for a purpose. Each step left behind the echoes of despair, and carried them closer to a future shaped by divine promise. Ishmael, the boy once mocked, once cast out, now carried within him the seed of nations. The desert winds no longer whispered of death, but of a legacy that would outlast the sands of time. Ishmael grew into a young man shaped by the wilderness. The desert was harsh, but it was also a teacher, chiseling strength into his body and resilience into his spirit. Each sunrise brought trials of heat and scarcity, yet each sunset bore witness to survival. The boy who once lay near death beneath a bush now roamed the sands with confidence, his steps guided by the memory of God's intervention. Hagar, watching her son become strong, found peace in knowing that the child she once feared to lose had been preserved for something far greater. With every passing year, Ishmael's skills reflected his environment. He became an archer of remarkable precision, his arrows finding their targets with unerring accuracy. The wilderness demanded hunters, and Ishmael answered that call with courage. His name spread among nomadic tribes as a youth who thrived where others faltered. The desert, which had once threatened his life, became the very forge of his destiny. He was no longer seen as a discarded son, but as a warrior molded by fire and wind. Though Hagar and Ishmael lived apart from Abraham's household, the bond between father and son was never erased from memory. Ishmael often wondered about the camp he had left behind, about the man whose arms had once lifted him high. He felt both pride and pain in being Abraham's firstborn, pride in his lineage, pain in his exile. Yet he held on to the promise spoken in the wilderness, the words that had declared his life meaningful. God has heard. Even in solitude, Ishmael believed those words continued to guide his path. Hagar never ceased reminding her son of the promise. At night, as stars filled the sky, she told him that God had sworn to multiply his descendants beyond number. Those stories were not merely comfort, they were fuel for Ishmael's growing sense of purpose. He understood that survival alone was not his destiny. He was chosen to become the father of nations, to leave behind more than footprints in the sand. The desert that seemed empty was actually rich with the unseen plans of heaven. As Ishmael matured, the image of Isaac haunted his thoughts. He had once mocked his younger brother, but the rivalry had left a scar deeper than laughter could reveal. He wondered if Isaac knew of his struggles, if Abraham spoke of him in the household, or if his name had been erased from memory. This tension between blood and distance became part of Ishmael's identity. He lived not as one forgotten, but as one set apart. The desert winds whispered to him that his story was not to compete with Isaac's, but to create a legacy of his own. In time, Ishmael grew tall and strong, a young man respected for his courage and endurance. His bow became an extension of his arm, and his leadership drew others to him. Small groups of wanderers began to gather around him, men who admired his strength and women who saw in him the promise of stability amid the shifting sands. Slowly, Ishmael's life transformed from that of an exile to that of a leader. The boy who had been cast out was becoming the foundation of a future nation. Yet Ishmael's rise was not without moments of reflection. Often he would walk to the edge of a dune, stare at the horizon, and remember the pain of his childhood. The mocking laughter, the separation, the desperate thirst, all of it lived within him as memories he could never erase. But instead of breaking him, these memories gave him fire. They reminded him that his strength was born from struggle, and his destiny was carved by survival. Every hardship was a stepping stone toward the man he was destined to become. Hagar, though older now, looked at her son with pride and awe. She recalled the moment she had placed him beneath the bush, believing his life was over. Now she saw him as a young man, whose very existence testified to the faithfulness of God. She marveled at how the child once near death had become a symbol of hope, proof that promises spoken in the desert were never empty. Her role as mother had been filled with pain, but in Ishmael's growth she found healing. The desert tribes began to speak of Ishmael not just as a survivor but as a man of destiny. His leadership drew loyalty, his courage commanded respect, and his faith in the unseen promise gave him an aura beyond his years. To those who followed him, Ishmael was not simply Abraham's son, he was the chosen one of the wilderness, destined to rise above exile and to leave behind a legacy written in the blood of nations. Each passing season added strength to the prophecy that his descendants would be uncountable. Despite his growing influence, Ishmael never forgot the voice that had once saved him. He remembered the angel's words to his mother, the well that appeared like a miracle in the desert, and the assurance that God had heard his cries. These memories anchored him, preventing pride from consuming his heart. Though he wielded power, he knew it was given, not earned. His survival was not his doing alone. It was evidence of divine intervention, and that humility gave his leadership depth. The desert, harsh as it was, became the stage where Ishmael's destiny unfolded. He was not merely a man surviving its trials, he was a man thriving because of them. His legacy was being shaped in silence, one arrow at a time, one step across the sand at a time. Ishmael's story was no longer one of abandonment, but of transformation. He was the living testimony that even when cast out, a life touched by God's promise cannot be erased. In the quiet moments of night, when the winds hushed and the stars stretched endlessly across the heavens, Ishmael felt a deep sense of calling. He was no longer the boy mocked at a feast, nor the child laid beneath a bush to die. He was the son whose cries had been heard by God, the man who would rise to father nations. His heart carried both the scars of rejection and the fire of destiny, blending pain and promise into one unbreakable identity. In the stillness of the desert, Ishmael understood. His journey was only beginning. As the years unfolded, Ishmael's life became a tapestry woven with both trials and triumphs. The desert had sculpted him into a man of resilience, and his reputation spread far beyond the dunes where he once wandered in despair. Tribes began to see him not only as a skilled archer, but as a leader capable of guiding people through hardship. His story was no longer confined to whispers of exile, but had become a testament to endurance, faith, and the mysterious ways in which destiny reveals itself through suffering. Ishmael's strength was matched by his growing wisdom. The pain of his childhood had not left him bitter, but rather sharpened his understanding of people. He knew what it meant to be cast aside, to thirst for water, to feel the sting of rejection. And because of this, he led with compassion even as he commanded with authority. Those who followed him felt that he was not merely a man shaped by the desert, but one chosen by heaven to carry a legacy greater than himself. His leadership drew families, warriors and wanderers into his circle. Hagar, who had once wept, believing her son would die beneath the scorching sun, now lived to see the fulfillment of God's promise. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she watched Ishmael grow into the man the angel had spoken of. Each day reminded her that no prayer goes unheard, no tear is wasted, and no desert is too barren for God to reveal his plan. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now shone with the light of a mother who had seen despair turned into destiny. She knew her part in the story was fading, but she rejoiced in her son's rise. The memory of Abraham still lingered in Ishmael's heart, a father both distant and beloved. Though separated by circumstance, Ishmael never ceased to honor the man who had given him life and faith. He carried the blood of Abraham in his veins, and with it the strength of a covenant that stretched across generations. His story was not to erase Isaac's, but to complement it, to show that God's blessings extend even into the places where human plans falter. Ishmael lived not in the shadow of his brother, but in the light of his own promise. The desert itself seemed to recognize Ishmael's transformation. Once a place of fear and scarcity, it became the cradle of his power. Each hunt, each journey, each survival carved more determination into his spirit. Where others saw endless emptiness, Ishmael saw possibility. The wilderness that had nearly taken his life had become the very ground from which his nation would rise. It was as if the desert had always been waiting for him, shaping him, testing him, and ultimately preparing him to fulfill his destiny. As his descendants grew, Ishmael's legacy began to spread like the sands shifting across the desert floor. Villages formed, alliances strengthened, and stories of his courage passed from generation to generation. He was no longer just the son cast out of his father's camp. He was the father of nations, the founder of a lineage that would endure through centuries. The boy who had once cried beneath a bush in despair was now the man whose name echoed across the wilderness with reverence and strength. The prophecy spoken by the angel was no longer a distant hope, but a living reality. Ishmael's people multiplied, his influence expanded, and the land that once seemed barren became alive with his descendants. Every child born, every tent raised, every arrow released was proof that God had not only heard, but had acted. The name Ishmael stood as a permanent reminder that divine promises are not hindered by human rejection. What others had meant for despair, God had transformed into destiny. Still, Ishmael never forgot the moment that defined his life. The cry in the desert, the well of water, the voice that spoke hope into death. These memories remained with him as a sacred testimony. He taught his children that survival was not just about strength, but about faith in the unseen. He reminded them that even when the world casts you aside, heaven remembers your name. His story was not simply about survival, but about transformation, a journey from abandonment to abundance. As the years aged him, Ishmael became a figure of awe among his people. His hair grew silver, his voice carried authority, and his eyes reflected the wisdom of a man who had endured storms of both heart and desert. Around him, his descendants thrived, forming the roots of nations. He was no longer the boy mocked at a feast, no longer the son torn from his father's tent. He was the patriarch of a people destined to endure. His life stood as a living monument to the resilience of faith. The desert winds, once cruel, now seemed to sing of his journey. Each gust whispered of the boy saved from death, of the man who rose to power, of the promise fulfilled. Ishmael's story was proof that abandonment does not define destiny and rejection does not erase purpose. His name carried the weight of survival and the glory of fulfillment, standing as a reminder for all generations that when God hears, he also provides. His life was the bridge between despair and hope, between exile and promise. Even in his final days, Ishmael's heart burned with gratitude. He had lived the impossible, from near death to fathering nations, from abandonment to honor. His legacy stretched far beyond what he could see, but he knew it would endure, for he was the living testimony of a truth eternal, that God's promises never fail, even when the path to them is carved through hardship. Ishmael's journey was not just his own, it was a lesson for all who would come after him, a call to trust when all seems lost. And so the story of Ishmael comes to rest not in sorrow, but in triumph. From the silence of the desert came a voice that changed everything. From abandonment grew nations, from despair blossomed hope. His life reminds us that even when we stand in the harshest wilderness, unseen by men and forgotten by the world, God hears. And just as Ishmael rose from exile to destiny, so too can we rise from our deserts into the promise that waits beyond. If this story touched your heart and gave you strength, I invite you to subscribe now and join this journey of faith and inspiration. Together, we will continue exploring the powerful stories that remind us we are never forgotten.